Hello there, and welcome to an area that we're not actually going to explore this time, but I do want to show off just for a brief moment, just to show off how annoying this new enemy type is. These guys are the Angsty Bones, and they like to do one thing, and they like to do it a lot. Teleport. Worse still, they are completely invincible while in the teleporting animation, so unless they decide to stop teleporting and try and attack you, you're never going to actually be able to hit them. And their attacks are fast enough that they're likely to hit you and stun you out of your own combos unless you're especially quick, and their attacks deal a surprisingly large amount of poison buildup and proc an especially lethal poison effect. Thankfully, we won't be having to deal with them for a little while. We're going to explore elsewhere today, but before we do any of that, we gotta get a new gear setup. We picked up this old patch set from the Red Hall of Cages, and I'm sure that a prisoner's rags are likely to serve as useful armor. It actually is a pretty decent light armor set, and it doesn't look that bad either. I especially like the hood. But the more important part of changing our gear setup is what new weapons we'll be using. And today we'll be using a mix of new and old. We're going to be transmuting that martial flail we used last time to a sword whip, the steel centipede in particular. Sword whips are a subclass of whips and behave like swords and whips, hence the name. They're pretty much purely superior to whips. They have the sword light attack moveset and the whip heavy attack moveset, which means they get all the good combos of a sword and can do a critical animation after a parry, and they have the long reach of the whip's heavy attack. And they don't even require proficiency in both weapon classes. A class 2 sword whip only requires class 2 whips in order to be wielded. So basically it gives you a sword even if you're focusing purely on whips. Add to that the fact that it's one of the better dex scaling weapons in the game, and you have a pretty good weapon for a dex build. The downside to sword whips is that you're rather starved for choices. There's the dex scaling Steel Centipede and the magic scaling Phoenix Tail, and that's about it. So if your build is focused on stats other than those, you can't really utilize sword whips. Fortunately, that's not really an issue for us. We will be using the Steel Centipede in both of our weapon loadouts. The first in tandem with a pistol, which will give us a ranged attack as well as an alternate damage type, since pistols deal both strike and blunt damage. And in the second loadout we'll be two-handing it for a little bit more damage in a slightly different moveset, as well as the ability to equip a charm, which will make it even stronger. There's a good chance that we'll actually return to using the Steel Centipede and the pistol in the future, so we're going to want to upgrade them as high as we possibly can at this point, which is to +4. Oh, we'll also be upgrading the Haymaker for reasons. You'll see those reasons a little bit later on in this episode. Just be patient. But with that, our upgrading business is finally finished. I may decide to actually cut that out in the future. I just find it so soothing that I like to leave it in. Worst case scenario, you can always skip it. Before we actually continue on though, we're going to purchase a whole bunch of flintlock shots. Whereas before they were prohibitively expensive, now they are quite cheap, relatively speaking. So it's not a bad idea to stock up to make sure that we can always fire our gun. And after just a little bit of cleanup of our item bar, just to make sure that it's not overly filled with things so we can quickly scroll what we need to, let's actually move on. Our destination is the Red Hall of Cages. If you recall, the Masterless Knight told us of two paths from the Red Hall, heading beneath it, or heading to the east towards the Dome of the Forgotten, the completion of which will lead us to the Ziggurat of Dust. Both of those places sound so nice, don't they? Let's go see what they're like. Being in this area does call to mind the fact that, so far, time seems to pass strangely here. At the start on the shivering shore, it was clearly a bright day, albeit one that was overcast, but progressing to the Castle of Storms turned it to night, which is fully confirmed here. We can't just say it's dark because of the storms, because they're long gone by now. What I'm getting at is that here on this strange island, time seems to be a function of space more than anything else. And I just felt that that was worth pointing out. Now, before we actually enter the Dome of the Forgotten, we're going to check down this side pathway here. Sadly, our progress is quickly balked by this red barrier here. We'll have to return here once we get the ability to remove them, but for now, we'll simply have to go back. After all, our destination is the Dome of the Forgotten and not the Ruined Temple. Damn, speaking of changing environments, this is certainly an aesthetic change. All of a sudden, it's a lot more bright and hospitable. Or at least it appears to be on the surface. I'm sure there's plenty of lethal things here that can kill us. One, in fact, is right in front of us here, this oddly suspicious chest. It is, in fact, a mimic. This enemy type is called Mimiku, and it is a mimic kraken. There is no ability to tell what chest is a real chest and what chest is a mimic. You just have to either whack them all or know in advance. Fortunately, there is no penalty for attacking actual chests, so if you're blind, there's no reason not to just whack every chest that you come across, just to be safe. If you try and open it up, they start chowing down on you, and though it's unlikely to kill you, at least if you're at full health, it does do a fair bit of damage. So, we're at the point of the game where we're actually going to start leaving stone idols to provide bonuses for the region that they're in, rather than to construct bases where we have useful merchants. We already have 2 good bases, one at the Shivering Shore and one in the Watching Woods, and most areas that we'll be going to at this point end up leading off on their own pathways that don't connect much to other areas. It is incredibly worthwhile to leave a blacksmith here because that gives us an attack bonus in this region, and this is an area where there are 2 bosses to be fought, and both can be fairly tricky, especially depending on what your gear setup is, so giving yourself the most possible damage is definitely ideal. Having a source of range damage, by the way, here is incredibly useful. There are a lot of aerial enemies that'll just stay barely out of your reach if you're using a short-ranged melee weapon. And that's not the only nasty trick that this area pulls. You know those vials of undersight that we've been picking up? This is why they exist. Nearly invisible creatures that are incredibly nasty because as soon as they aggro onto you, they will follow you to the ends of the earth. I said that they're nearly invisible because even if you haven't used a vial, you can tell that they're there if you know what to look for. They leave a very faint shadow in areas where they are, just enough to tell that they're there, and that you should be using a vial of undersight once you know about this mechanic. Thankfully, this is the only area in the game where the Whispermen show up. So even if you're having trouble dealing with them, just get through this area and you'll be fine. Oh, gun spam is so fun and so effective. Definitely better than using steel centipede, since these guys are heavily resistant to slashing damage. The enemy stats in this area are actually fairly interesting because most of the enemies heavily resist slashing damage, but the 2 bosses are very weak to it and instead heavily resist bludgeoning damage. So being able to deal both types of damage in this area is definitely the ideal way of approaching things, and the gun works very handily for that. You know, progression-wise, I think it makes sense to do this area after the Red Hall of Cages. Not necessarily immediately after, but definitely sometime after you've beaten it, just due to how the enemies are scaled. And yet, in terms of overall area quality, this place is definitely a step down compared to the Red Hall. It has some of the same hallmarks of level design of a lot of verticality and a greater inclusion of platforming than most of the previous areas we've seen. But it just does those things less well. On the other hand, it is actually a much better area if you're looking for goodies. You may have noticed that we already came across one free Amber Idol, the second only, the first being from our starting effects, and we'll come across a third not too far in the future. This is where they actually start giving you some good stuff and letting you play around with the alchemy for once. Also, yeah, you can see just how annoying it is to take out these armor giants if your main source of damage is slash damage, which is why I gave up at the end there and just started blasting away, since the gun does 50% bludgeoning damage. Not that the game would ever actually tell you that, of course. I can understand being inspired so strongly by Dark Souls wanting to keep some mechanical stuff under wraps, but that just wasn't a good idea in this case. There's a lot of arcane stuff going on under the hood with regards to scaling and special properties on some weapons, and you're never likely to figure that out, even if you play through the game multiple times. And in fact, there is very little information on how a lot of that stuff works. At least information that's easily available. There are a few mods for the game, one of which is a major balance mod, which actually fixes a lot of the issues that the base game has with scaling, namely that it doesn't really make sense with how it works. You can't just take a look at a weapon's base damage and then its scaling and know at a rough glance how it's going to shape up in the future. You pretty much have to look at the wiki to see how strong a weapon that you're using is going to compare to other things. But I digress. I kind of just glossed over there a near ambush with the Whispermen, and why you want to be drinking one of those vials of Undersight fairly regularly, even if you've done the area before and theoretically know where the Whispermen are, because it's easy to get surprised by them. Like right here. Yeah, this is not an especially fun mechanic, and again, this is the only area where it is used, thankfully. That said, this encounter here, which is right before the first boss, is a fairly nasty one. If you try and immediately take out the Whisperman, you're likely just going to get ganked by the Bronze Knight here. And much like the previous Bronze Knights we encountered, the best solution is to parry and riposte, as always. Or to let them commit suicide, apparently. Hey, I'll take it. It's worth pointing out that starting with that Bronze Knight, any we encounter in the future will respawn just like any other enemy. They're just a regular old enemy now. So, here's the boss, and we can even get a brief glimpse at what it looks like. Just from that brief glimpse, it looks like it's going to be rather nasty, having some sort of large scythe-like claws or something like that. But it's definitely a boss that looks more fearsome than it actually is. At the very least for us. For one thing, the Untouched Inquisitor has only 3 attacks, all of which are pretty easily dodged. Some of them you can even avoid just by standing in the right spot, you don't even need to dodge roll. And while he boasts a fearsome 500 bludgeoning resistance, he has negative slash resistance. And given our primary source of damage here is slash, and he also happens to be weak to arcane, it doesn't take too long to bring him down to size. I will point out that this is largely because of our gear setup going into the fight. If all of our damage was in bludgeoning and we didn't really have a way to get around that, this boss would be a fair bit more difficult, or at least he would take longer to kill. His attacks are easy to dodge no matter what you're doing. I think that the Untouched Inquisitor might actually be intentionally designed to be a little bit easy, a mid-boss acting as a boss encounter of sorts before the actual boss of this place, who we'll be seeing in a bit. For beating the boss, it lowers these ladders here, which allows us to progress and unlock a handy shortcut back to the start. That enemy that we took out there was a Whisper Lady. They come individually as opposed to in groups like the Whispermen and are rather potent mages. They are potentially more dangerous if you end up being ambushed by them while not under the effects of Undersight. Now, before we actually continue on in the dome, we're actually going to change up our gear once more. Thanks to our exploration here, we now have 2 more Amber Idols in our possession, and it is with Amber Idols that you can make generally the best gear from alchemy. or at least the most interesting gear. So let's return to our little base in the Watching Woods. You may actually have a general idea of what we're going to transmute. Remember how I was upgrading the Haymaker for no apparent reason? Well, this is the reason. Using the ashes from the Untouched Inquisitor, we can make his own weapon, the Purifier. It is one of the better scythes in the game, being fairly powerful and uniquely scaling with Wisdom. Although it has holy damage, the holy damage is not what scales with Wisdom, and instead its physical damage does. But because it has that holy damage natively, it accepts holy buffs even better, because you're stacking holy damage. Completely unrelated to what I was just talking about, can you guess what the next boss we're going to be fighting is most weak to? And no, you're not getting 3 guesses. So currently we don't actually have the ability to use class 3 polearms or scythes. So that's why we're on the Tree of Skill, but if you're paying attention to what I'm doing here, you may notice that I'm making a bit of a mistake. In that I'm not actually purchasing any halberd skills and instead I'm purchasing sword skills. You see, swords and halberds start off in the center of the Tree of Skill, but they quickly branch out in their own directions. Swords in the upward path and halberds in the upper right. And I kind of forgot that. And now, with all of those black pearls spent, we don't actually have enough left over to acquire the ability to wield class 3 halberds. Even leveling up using all of our remaining salt doesn't bring us all the way there. Fortunately, there is a mechanic in the game that allows you to fix mistakes that you've made while leveling up along the Tree of Skill. The Grey Pearls. This actually might be the first time that I've ever used Grey Pearls when I've played this game, because I've never been dumb enough to make this mistake before. But thank you developers for including this, it saved my bacon here. So that aside, let's actually get back to discussing the Purifier. If you paid attention to when we transmuted it and when we transmuted the Steel Centipede from our Bullwhip before, you may have noticed that something happened to its upgrade level. Rather than being completely overwritten, its upgrade level is dropped by 1. This occurs whenever you transmute anything to anything else, its upgrade level drops by 1. Now at a glance, it seems like upgrading the Haymaker then before we transmuted it was a bad move, because that just means we lost 1 level's worth of upgrade materials and salt. However, in this case specifically, and in more cases we'll be seeing in the future, it's actually the better way to go about things. As a weapon transmuted from a boss's item, it actually upgrades using a different set of materials, a much rarer set of upgrade materials. So when you're going from a normal weapon to a boss weapon, you want to upgrade it as much as you possibly can beforehand, because those regular materials are so much more readily available. As you can see, we have no Drowned Locket, so we cannot bring our Purifier up to +4, whereas doing so for the Haymaker that it used to be was very easy to do. Now, before we leave this topic, I should bring up that there are a total of 5 types of materials, each with 4 tiers of materials. 1 tier to bring it to +2, 1 to bring it to +4, 1 to bring it to +6, and then 1 to max it out at +7. The types themselves are regular, like the Locks of Hair or the Soldier's Poems, boss, all sorts of drowned stuff, fire, the only example of which we've come across so far being some charred dolls that we picked up from killing cytoplasms back in the Watching Woods, which I never bothered to point out because it wasn't relevant at the time. And then ice, which I don't believe we've come across at all so far. Oh, and there's actually a 6th type of upgrade material, beast stuff like the Endless Fangs that we've come across from killing dogs. I don't consider that to be as relevant as the other 5 main types because there are very few items that upgrade with those materials. Yet, the developers apparently looked at Demon Souls and decided that its upgrade system was not complicated enough. Anywho, moving on to less annoying subjects. Now that we have a scythe, some of these enemies are easier to deal with and other enemies are more difficult to deal with. The Whispermen, and Whisper Ladies for that matter, are much easier to deal with thanks to our blessed damage from the Purifier, that we're double dipping on with the blessed pages we purchased from the cleric that we placed all the way back at the beginning of the episode. The Bronze Knight, however, is more difficult since we can't do a proper critical animation after parrying him, although I figure out a way around that. Turns out you have enough time to get off the special Scythe combo, which actually does pretty good damage, and eventually lets us stomp him to death. Oh yeah, be sure not to activate this elevator immediately, as it makes getting down here, and thus down here, so much more difficult. You have to do a very precarious jump where you just kind of jump just barely off the right side, and then angle towards the left to grab the bottom ledge. Whereas if the elevator is still there, you can just drop from the elevator itself and it's a lot easier. Platforming with fall damage, isn't that such a good thing to include in your video game? And hell, it's not even all that bad in this area. We have yet to reach the truly nasty areas with regards to that. Everything in due time, ladies and germs. So, despite the fact that there is still a significant chunk of the video left, we're actually right by the second boss. It's not too long of a run, even if you do have to take out the enemies along the way. Let's just say there's a reason why there's still a good chunk of the video left over. Although it may not be exactly the reason that you think it is. Anyway, this boss is certainly a toughie, one of the harder bosses in the game, and my number one advice: don't go into this fight unless you have a source of slash damage. Because this guy, the Third Lamb, has 500 bludgeoning resistance, much like the Untouched Inquisitor had, and he has around 3 times the HP. Needless to say, if you try and beat this guy with bludgeoning damage, you're going to be here for a while. I did that once on a previous playthrough and it took me like 5 minutes to whittle him down. It was ridiculous. As for the boss himself, we don't seem to be having too much trouble with him. We've already taken out around half of his HP. And that's because the real fight starts here. In his second phase, he gets more aggressive like most of the bosses we've fought before, but in his case that actually amounts to a lot more than it has in the past. He ends up adding a lot of extra attacks in his attack combos, including ranged lightning projectiles that like to home in on you, and deal plenty of damage. Add in the fact that a lot of his attacks have next to no windup or cause shockwaves that travel along the ground, increasing his effective range, and you have a fight where it's very easy to end up getting juggled by the boss. Well, strictly speaking, not juggled in the traditional fighting game sense, but more so not being given any time for a breather to heal up or anything like that. Even so, this attempt is going pretty well. We've had to use a lot of our healing items. We only have 1 remaining, but the boss himself is also nearly dead. We're 2 steps away from victory. And it is when we are 2 steps away from victory that I make a mistake that ends up sealing our fate. Taking a little bit of damage that honestly we could have just shrugged off and only done 1 more attack to finish off the boss, I instead elect to heal, which was a mistake. Because the Third Lamb in his second phase is able to pretty easily close the distance and prevent healing, like you saw there. I just want you to keep in mind that this is a boss that I know better than pretty much any other boss in the game. I once decided to do an ore-only challenge run, which I didn't end up completing. And when I got to the Third Lamb, oh boy was that a trial by fire. Ironic since he doesn't actually use fire and is actually very weak to it. But yeah, I had a difficult time and I ended up fighting him probably a few dozen times. However, as a result, I pretty much eventually had his moveset completely memorized and could even react to his attacks that have next to no windup. And I'm bringing that all up here just to point out that I still had a lot of trouble with him. He's a pretty tough boss, even if you know what you're doing and have a good gear loaded out for him. Cue 10 people responding in the thread that, oh, they had no trouble with him and have beaten him in 1 try on all of their playthroughs. Because that's how these games kind of work out. Anyway, I don't really have too much more to say here other than that if you have buffs, it can be wise to save them just before the second phase of the fight, which is why we're not using our golden wine at the start. So enjoy this second and much more competent go at the Third Lamb. As I said, a much more competent run at the boss. Barely even had to use any healing items. And since we finished the fight with the golden wine effect active, we got a truck ton of gold. If you want to work your way to that golden axe, this is pretty much how you do it. But whether you had a difficult or an easy time with the boss, the reward is very much worth it, and okay, I just can't help but giggle at the silliness of the golden wine effect when we're zoomed in here, talking with this NPC. So in terms of how interesting a character he is, this guy is definitely on the low end of the scale, but he's definitely one of the more important NPCs in terms of gameplay. He not only informs us as to the nature of Hardlight, those weird blue shimmers that we've seen in various areas of the game, but he also gives us the ability to interact with it via a new brand. You know, I don't think I've commented on this before, but it is metal as fuck that your character upgrades in this game come from brands that you receive upon your flesh. Like, think about that. Even though it is a magical brand, presumably it hurts as much as a regular one. That searing iron piercing the flesh and burning it forever. Can't be all that pleasant of an experience, I imagine. So, an important thing about this brand here, don't just sally off the ledge once you pick it up, you should really read the brand's description first. Wear this brand to imbue your torch with the light, allowing you to render blue arcane matter tangible. Your torch. Not you by default. Can you by any chance guess what people tend to do on their first playthrough immediately after receiving the brand? Hint, it is not related to living a long and fulfilling life. Yeah, a lot of people just tend to immediately walk off that ledge without first reading the brand's description. That right there is why I love watching blind playthroughs or streams of this game. That moment is always magical. Speaking of magical, this here is a rather awkward situation that I really could have easily avoided if I had actually thought about what I was doing. I just wanted to get back to the sanctuary so I could rest and end the recording. Turns out that the path that I elected to take when dropping down ended up aggroing several Whispermen, and things did not turn out nicely, as you just saw there. Thankfully, NPCs that are aggroed in the shrine by other enemies cannot actually be killed by those enemies. They just come back much like you. I guess that cleric must be making a fortune off of this business. Thankfully, it was the Steel Hornet that ended up landing the finishing blow, so salt retrieval is actually pretty easy. But that's all that there is of import in this video, so I'm just gonna leave you to me retrieving my salt. Which thankfully does not go horribly awry. So yeah, see ya.